What defines each game genre? What is an action game versus an adventure game? Is Dota an RPG, a strategy game, or an action slaughterhouse? Does it even matter? Hey guys, it's Harry. I've been a game designer and producer for the past 11 years, and today we're talking about a very cool topic, game genres. I have read a bunch of books about game theory, game design, and all of that. I love that topic. And I always found fascinating this discussion about what game genres are, what defines them, and especially where you draw the line. Like, can you pinpoint the end of a game genre versus the start of the next one? That is a very interesting discussion, so buckle up because there's a lot for us to talk about. Oh, and also don't forget to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, help me win this YouTube algorithm in this crazy TikTok era. Alright, first let's give some context and examples to this discussion. What are the game genres that we know and what games best represent each of them? Okay, let me list them to you. We have action games, probably the most familiar to most people. Then we have strategy games, adventure games, RPGs, puzzle games, and simulation games. Those are the 6 biggest and most high-level game genres. Pretty much any game in the world can be associated with one of these main genres. I'm sure you're thinking of a lot more and different genres than these, right? What about racing games, or MMOs, or Souls-like? Aren't these all genres as well? Well, yes and no. There's action, adventure, RPG, strategy, simulation, and puzzle games. Pretty much every other game can be included as a subgenre or a mix of different genres. But a big disclaimer here is that there's no definition set in stone. Nobody came down from the sky saying, okay, here it is. Here you have your definitions of game genres. Heck, we cannot even pinpoint what a game is, like a definition of a game itself. I also love this discussion about the game definition itself, like what is a game, what is not a game, the edge cases. That is super fascinating. So maybe that's a topic for another video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. That would be a fun discussion. But anyway, while there's no singular definition for all game genres, there are some accepted concepts in game theory. So let's start simple. What defines a game genre? How do we classify games in different buckets? Simply put, we look at the core mechanic of the game, the main way you interact with the game to define what type of game that is. Starting with the most known, we have action. Well, what is an action game? An action game is any game in which the main way you interact with the character, the interface, and the challenges presented is via hand-eye coordination. Every action game, by definition, will require hand-eye coordination from the player, in such a way that the better your coordination is, the more skilled you are at the game. Let's take the quintessential type of action games, first-person shooters. You have a gun, and you have to shoot stuff that appears on the screen. How do you interact with your character? By moving the mouse, the cursor, by firing at the precise moment to hit your target. If you miss your targets every single time, well, you're pretty bad, but mainly you will never progress. You'll be forever stuck or most likely dead in the game. So the more coordinated you are to aim and shoot, the more you will succeed. That's an action game. Let's take another example, Sonic. In Sonic, you need to run and jump at precise moments in gameplay. Especially Sonic being a very fast and furious game, the quicker your reaction time is to the obstacles that you face, the better you will perform. Hand-eye coordination. What your eyes see on the screen, your hands react precisely and fast. That is the main way you interact with the game. It doesn't matter how many other systems a Sonic game might have, that is the core, and without that, there's no Sonic. Once again, that's an action game. Now let's look at a very interesting example in the games industry. Adventure games. What exactly are adventure games? Well, that is a very tricky question, and we need to step back in time a little bit for this one, because today we don't really think much about adventure games. We usually call games like Mario and Zelda action adventure games, and this is not exactly wrong, but also not a very accurate description, at least from the original definition. Adventure games are driven by narrative, by the story. The main way you as a player interact with the game and its interface is via exploration and puzzle solving to drive the narrative forward. The term itself came from a game called The Colossal Cave Adventure, which was a text-only game developed by Will Crowther in 1976 for the PDP-10 mainframe computer, those gigantic computers the size of an entire room. I'm not sure you remember those choose-your-own-adventure books. Definitely the youngest of you will not remember that. But those were kind of interactive books in which you choose different paths for the story while reading it, and then you have to jump to different pages to see the results, kind of a branching storyline. Well, adventure games came from that. And the Colossal Cave Adventure was the precursor of every adventure game, but it was text only. The first graphical adventure game was The Mystery House, released in 1980 by Sierra Online, one of the most famous publishers of adventure games back in the day. There were a lot of cool games from my time published by Sierra. Yep, it's true. I'm not getting any younger. So, adventure games focus on exploration and puzzle solving to drive the narrative. Exploration is a very wide concept here. For a text-only game, or maybe a graphic novel, exploration might be choosing different dialogue options that give you different results. And then we get into the tricky part. You ask me, but wait, most games make you explore the map or solve any kind of puzzle to drive progression. Everything would be an adventure game from that definition. And you would not be totally wrong. Zelda games are called action-adventure because you need both to fight your way through the game against several opponents using good hand-eye coordination, but there's also a whole lot of puzzle elements for you to solve. There are two main arguments to understand this. First, we need to try and check the main mechanic driving the game. In the case of Zelda, I would still argue that running, jumping, and fighting is the main way you interact with the world and the character, thus being more of an action game than adventure. But the really tricky thing is that most games today are actually hybrids. There's a lot of action elements, puzzle mechanics, and even RPG leveling systems or tech trees. That is a given today, but not in the 1970s and 80s. Back then, games were very limited, and they could only do one or two things at a time. They could only have one or two main mechanics that would drive the entire gameplay. Adventure games would be full of dialogue options for you to choose or certain puzzles for you to resolve. And that was it. For example, a classic adventure game is The Secret of the Monkey Island, released in 1990 by Lucasfilm Games. The game used a point-and-click style interface to make you move your character, talk to NPCs, progress through the story, and solve puzzles. The focus is not on hand-eye coordination like action games. You can take your time, and usually the game will only respond when you action commands to the character. You see the difference? Nowadays it might seem very blurry and you might have difficulties imagining a pure adventure game. And it really is hard. Like we said, we barely see pure adventure games these days. Maybe graphic novels, but even they might have other systems or progression mechanics. Another old classic and a favorite of mine was Thorin's Passage, a fascinating game with Disney-like cartoon graphics and very intriguing and memorable characters. It was published by Sierra and Activision in 1995, right around my childhood. The game is also a point-and-click adventure where you collect items to solve puzzles and you have to make correct choices with the environment that you have around you. It's pretty sick for the time, the kind of game that we don't see a lot today. Okay, we've talked about action games and adventure games. What is next? Let's talk strategy. Strategy games are games that focus on strategic and tactical planning. So you have a specific set of moves, strategies, or abilities that you can perform, and your challenge is to plan ahead of time and execute your strategy to win the game. The best way to think of strategy games is actually to go analog. Think of chess. Chess is the quintessential strategy game. It's not about hand-eye coordination, not about reaction time. and not about driving the story forward either. A strategy game might have a story included in it, or maybe even an abstract context in the case of chess. It's about warfare. You have your pawns and knights and kings. Is an abstract warfare game. But all in all, it's about planning ahead. You have your turn, your set of moves and pieces and positions, and you plan around that to fulfill your goal, that is to capture your enemy's king. Bringing that logic to video games, we can talk about Age of Empires, which is a classic example of a strategy video game which I'm proudly a part of, working with the teams behind Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition. In AoE 2, you choose your civilization, which provides you different units, buildings, upgrades, and bonuses, and you have to defeat your opponent's army and civilization in real-time warfare. And then you think, wait a minute, I played Age of Empires, I played StarCraft. Those games are crazy and require a lot of hand-eye coordination. You need to react fast in order to win. That is true, for sure, but the main pillar of the game is not that. You can be as fast as you want, click frantically with your mouse, but if you're pulling your archers to directly fight the enemy's knights, you are dead. That is because there's a relationship of strengths and weaknesses, the rock, paper, scissors relationship across different units, infantry, archers, knights, and so on. So planning ahead, as well as developing your economy, is much more important in Age of Empires, StarCraft, or any other strategy game than clicking fast with your mouse. Once again, a game might have many ways for the player to interact with it, but when considering a game's genre, we need to look at the core of the experience. While real-time strategy games will have a more prominent action element, turn-based strategy games are more in point with the core of the genre, which is planning your cards and thinking ahead. And as we're talking about cards, Magic the Gathering would perfectly fit that definition. You take turns, take your time, make and execute your strategy to win over your opponent. Magic was released as a physical card game in 1993, designed by Richard Garfield, the legendary game designer. And it's the first TCG ever released that is still being developed to this day. It's crazy. Magic is a global phenomenon that stood the test of time, and it got several different digital versions, the most notable and successful being MTG Arena. So that is strategy. Next, we're going to look into yet another fan favorite, role-playing games. Oh boy, buckle up because we have a lot to talk about. But in the same spirit that we have been guiding this discussion, what is the core element of an RPG? How do you interact with the game? Well, almost always you impersonate a character. If you are an abstract commander of a full army, that's usually strategy game territory, right? So in an RPG, you are the character. Okay, but we can say the same about action games and adventure games as well. What do you do in an RPG that you don't do in those other genres? That's right, you level up. You gain some kind of experience points and you make your character stronger over time, usually by defeating more and bigger foes. One of the most famous and recognized RPGs of all time is the Elder Scrolls series, which we talked about in our last episode of A Brief History of Video Games. Check it out if you haven't already. Other very famous RPGs include the Final Fantasy series, The Witcher, Baldur's Gate, Dark Souls, Mass Effect, Persona, and many others. RPG is definitely one of my top game genres, some of the most incredible games ever created. And if you didn't guess already, all of the concepts for an RPG came from the 1974 Dungeons & Dragons, created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. D&D is the absolute Bible of RPGs, and pretty much all of the concepts that we have came from there. Attributes, experience points, character classes, weapon types, sorcery, everything. We don't want to trace the full backstory here, but D&D was also inspired by other games that came before it, like Chainmail, a tabletop miniature war game also created by Gary Gygax and released in 1971. And all of it, the fantasy setting and everything, obviously inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. All hail Lord of the Rings. Sorry, I had to do that. So yeah, the main thing you do that makes an RPG is to develop your character. That's via attributes, experience points, abilities, new weapons and gear, all of it. But the tricky thing is that RPGs are probably the most hybrid of all genres nowadays. Action games have RPG-like progression mechanics, you have subgenres like action RPGs, and games like Diablo are a masterful example. So it's hard to picture an RPG in isolation. For that, we need to go back in history again and remember that back in the day, games were very constrained and could only pull off one or two things at a time. The best candidate for the first digital RPG in history was the Ultima franchise, which was called Akalabeth and released in 1979 by Richard Garriott. We covered all about Ultima in our episode number 1 of A Brief History of Video Games, so check it out if you want to know more about it. It was a very fascinating journey. In Ultima, you had the essential RPG elements: a character that you can build, name, choose a class for, go on an adventure to slay monsters, earn experience points, collect gold and gear, and talk to NPC characters. So there's a whole convention established for RPGs, and it's hard to separate them. So if maybe you have your character that you develop, but there's no story, just the mechanics, how much of an RPG that still is? It's hard to pinpoint, but definitely developing your character via some kind of progression and level system, plus moving through the story are the two pillars of a role-playing game. All of that trying to mimic the dynamics of Dungeons and Dragons and the freedom that the tabletop game provides. And then we have simulation games, this time trying to mimic real life. Or something close enough, but not really. Simulation games are trying to mimic, aka simulate, any kind of real-world activities or systems. They are called simulation because they do have a simulation system that runs independently of the player. In a tycoon game, for instance, there's a whole simulation of the real-world people, buildings, economy, and so on. Almost all simulation games will be real-time in order to have a proper simulation running as you play the game. Other games are simulating real-world activities in diverse forms, like racing games or flight simulators. The key thing in these games will be to accurately simulate real-world engines, acceleration, gravity, and so on. If you have a racing game that's more cartoonish or simply not accurate enough with the real world, it can barely be considered a simulation at all. It would be more of an arcade game, which is a subgenre of action. Some of the most recognized simulation games will be SimCity, Railroad Tycoon, Microsoft's Flight Simulator, and Forza, even though the latter is not necessarily an ultra-accurate representation of real-world racing. And then, the last of the major genres is puzzle. Puzzle games are something very interesting, because if we bring them to the real world and analyze puzzles like the Rubik's Cube or even a jigsaw puzzle, they can barely be considered games at all. They are something at the edge of what a game definition would imply. They are more of toys, instruments that you can use to entertain yourself or maybe train in some way, and they usually have one or a few paths to the correct answer, and that is a very important distinction. The Rubik's Cube has one final state every time. So does a jigsaw puzzle and almost all other physical puzzles. And when we bring that to digital games, we have an interesting mix. The puzzles themselves inside the game, the activity of solving them, can barely be considered games in a more formal sense. However, when you combine that with the virtual world, the controls, the interface, then it wraps everything around a game envelope. It's hard not to call Jonathan Blow's The Witness a game, right? It is clearly a game, even though if considered in isolation, each of the puzzles in the game could have a different consideration. And last, I want to talk about a very important and exciting point when we discuss game genres, the alchemy of mixing them up, the hybrid subgenres. And what is fascinating to me is that sometimes, every now and then in a generation, we see some new subgenres that explode in popularity and create a mass of followers and similar games. Once upon a time, you had a real-time strategy game, Warcraft 3. Actually, it started with StarCraft in a special mod called Aeon of Strife that generated a lot of hype and followers, but it soon evolved to another mod, but this time in Warcraft 3 called Defense of the Ancients. Yep, you know it, I know it, we all know it. That became Dota, and then League of Legends, and the rest is history. It sprung one of the most powerful subgenres in the world, MOBAs, which are going strong to this day. There are several successful MOBAs on the PC, console, and even mobile, with huge live tournaments and millionaire prize pools. And MOBA is a subgenre of strategy, created by adding and modifying different elements from strategy and other genres. In a MOBA, you control a single character in a party of usually 5x5 battles. So different from a regular strategy game, you are not an abstract commander of an army, but you play a single character. And each character will have its own set of abilities and archetypes for you to master. So every single character has a lot of different possibilities. And there's also elements of RPGs like leveling up, purchasing new gear with gold, and so on. Another incredible example is Fortnite, PUBG, and all of the Battle Royale subgenre. They are clearly action games, usually third-person or first-person shooters, driven by hand-eye coordination, but with a twist. It might not have a direct mix of other genres, but they have a specific subset of mechanics and dynamics that unify the subgenre. You have 100 players in a confined map shooting each other, grabbing new gear, and trying to survive until there's only one last man standing. Or woman, by the way. So there's a set of specific rules. You start the match usually in a plane or something, so you have the ability to land in different parts of the map, which is part of the strategy. You start without any gear or only maybe basic gear, and you have to grab what you find. And while you fight other players, there's a shrinking play zone, usually via a poisonous fog or any other kind of constraint that restricts the play area until all survivors are trapped in a smaller area. That helps drive the climax of the match in intense close battles. As a developer, I had the opportunity to work on a very big and ambitious Battle Royale AAA game called Off the Grid. It was an incredible experience and definitely one of the highlights of my career. The interesting thing is that if you change one of these rules and you keep changing them, at some point you stop having a Battle Royale altogether. Isn't that interesting? The subgenre is kind of a fluid combination of game rules. If you make other rules, you have another type of game. And as I said before, sometimes this new type of game revolutionizes the market. I find that a fascinating phenomenon. Alright, that was our journey across the theory and practice of game genres. There's definitely a lot more we can talk about, but I don't want to make this video extra long, so we'll call it here. But I would love to know your thoughts about all of it and other topics that you would like me to cover here in the channel. So leave in the comments below. Alright guys, that's it for today. If you did enjoy, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch you guys next time.